Now, staying on this topic to talk more about Brexit, I'm joined by Aarti, Shankar, a political analyst at Open Europe in London. Thank you, Ms. Shankar, for joining us. First off, you thought the Conservatives were going to increase their share of the vote. They haven't. Are you surprised?
I think a lot of commentators in Britain will be surprised at this result. That's not to say it was completely unpredicted. There were polls that suggested that perhaps we would be moving towards a hung parliament, and the Conservatives would be in a rather unprecedented situation where the vote that they called in order to strengthen their hand actually ended up in them losing their majority. It is unclear at this point in time what the next stages will be. The Conservatives remain the largest party, and understandably there will now be intense negotiations and meetings to understand what steps they can take forward now, and of course whether or not Theresa May will be leading them in the future Brexit negotiations.
Now, Brussels were undoubtedly watching this election very closely, with Brexit negotiations due to take place June 19th. How will this election potentially impact those negotiations?
So as the situation stands right now, it looks very likely that we could be moving towards a minority Conservative government. Now that could be very difficult for the Brexit negotiations because, of course, a minority government is inherently more unstable and more unpredictable. And that is not good either for the EU or the UK in these negotiations. It will be imperative that as the 2 years continue, the EU will be looking to the UK to be able to deliver and implement the agreements and negotiations that they come to. And whether or not a minority government will be able to do that is uncertain. Of course, the Commission and some representatives of national parliaments or member states within the EU have been very clear that they understand. For instance, the French Prime Minister has said he understands that this does not necessarily change the Brexit situation, and it is an issue for domestic politics in the UK. And I think that is the correct understanding of the situation at this point in time.
Does this make a no-deal scenario more likely?
That's a good question. I think if we look back to the manifestos before yesterday's vote, the two main parties, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, were very clear that they would look to implement the referendum vote from last year, i.e. Britain will be leaving the European Union. There had been some commentation before the vote yesterday that perhaps if we were in a situation for a hung parliament where Labour and Lib Dems and SNP perhaps formed a coalition, a progressive coalition as it was called, we could be in a situation where a second vote would be on the table. I would suggest at this point in time that seems unlikely. If the Conservatives are to form a government arrangement with the Democratic Unionist Party, we do look in a very certain position to be leaving the European Union.
So the economy has taken a hit with the pound falling to a 2-month low as a result of this shock outcome. How might this impact debate over whether the UK should have a clean break from the EU single market?
I think we have to recognise, of course, that when Theresa May called for this election, she suggested it would be an election to strengthen her hand and to give her a decisive mandate for her vision of Brexit, which is, of course, to leave the single market and to leave the customs union. The fact that she did not get that decisive majority and, in fact, lost her previous overall majority will raise some questions about whether or not her strategy on Brexit is the correct one. However, I would be cautious here because if we look at the Labour manifesto, there are certain divergences with the Conservatives' key claims, i.e. whether or not a no-deal situation would be good for Britain or not. But the indications that Labour would also look to end free movement, that they would look to obtain the benefits of the single market or the customs union, but without stating that they would look to maintain their position within it, suggests that the UK could be actually moving down the similar route that Theresa May laid out in her manifesto.
Thank you very much for your insights, Aarti Shankar there.